Hello and welcome to Mabinda TV. So for now, this is Good News Africa, where I look at the top headlines in Africa and then attempt to make sense of those headlines. So we'll start with the Daily Monitor Uganda. From the Daily Monitor Uganda, Vice President Alupo pushes for expanded China trade. So this is about trade with China. So should Africa be looking towards China for more trade? I think Africa inter-African trade is what should be promoted. Basically, the inter-African trade is only 10%, whereas the intra-Asia Pacific, intra-North America, intra-EU trade is in the north upwards of 50%. So why can't we trade with each other? I think if we just focus on trading with each other, then I think we could be on a pathway to success. So that's what I think could help. And I think really trading within ourselves, we will keep the money right here in Africa. I think you have we have bottlenecks towards the regional trade. Basically, with the coming of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, hopefully we will be able to trade within Africa. And I think just think about it. We usually prefer foreign-made goods, but this should not be so. I just think if Africans, we need to make it easy for goods and people to travel around Africa. That is what we need to do. And I think you have the Nigerian billionaire, the richest African, that is Aliko Dangote, says that he needs at least 37 visas to travel around Africa. So you can imagine Aliko Dangote needs 37 visas to travel around Africa, and I don't think that augurs well. And for that case, he has opened an office in New York to diversify his trading portfolio. So you can imagine that basically uh, we need to be we need to be trading with each other. I just think that should be the normal way to be, and I think the Made in Africa brand doesn't have to begin great. It can begin slowly and then gradually value add. If you think about it, even the Japanese brands such as Toyota, Toshiba, Sony, Mitsubishi, Isuzu, Nissan, they didn't start out great. They started out average, and then they gradually reinvested the profits back to R&D, and that's how they managed to become. That's how they managed to become to surpass Western brands in quality. That's how they managed to be a mark of stellar quality. Remember, Gemba Kaizen, continuous improvement, is from Japan. So basically, that shows you that we too can do it. Let's begin with the Made in Africa brand, and then gradually we can shift that so that then we we are able to trade within Africa. So let me know on what you think about this headline from the Daily Monitor Uganda, that is Vice President Alupo pushes for expanded China trade. Then I will move over to another top headline from the Citizen Tanzania. A new social protection policy brings Tanzania's informal sector workers into national safety net. So this is about social protection. So basically, Tanzania follows the principle of socialism espoused by the founding father, Julius Nyerere, who wanted Ujamaa, that is African socialism. So Tanzania is really a socialist country. So basically, the rich are turned in Tanzania. That's not to mean that capitalism is not practiced. It is practiced, but the form of government there is one of socialism. In fact, the Tanzania does not see eye to eye with its northern neighbor Kenya, basically because of Tanzania is a socialist country, whereas Kenya is a capitalistic country. So of course, and I think the East African community is not moving forward because Tanzania and Kenya don't see eye to eye. Of course, Uganda is somewhere in between the socialism and capitalism. So that's it. And I think the Kenyan president, Kenyan departed deceased Prime Minister Raila Odinga had wanted a cash transfer of 6,000 Kenyan shillings for every vulnerable Kenyan for about 1 million families in Kenya. So, of course, that is something that the president of Kenya, William Ruto, threw cold water on with this bottom up economic agenda. So, do we need socialism in Africa? Remember, socialism is about sharing the cake, while capitalism is about baking the cake. So that's the basic difference. That socialism is about sharing the cake, while capitalism is about baking the cake. And I think socialism is about equality of opportunity. Of course, that does not mean equal outcomes. That does not mean equal outcomes, but it means getting everyone to the same starting lineup. That's very different from capitalism, which is about uh, uh, individual dynamism, pulling yourself by your own bootstraps. And that's, I think, there needs to be a fine balance, a sweet spot between individual creative genius excellence as afforded by capitalism and society excellence as afforded by equality of opportunity. I think that's the way we can promote that's a way we can promote both socialism and capitalism. And I think one country which has the best of both is China. Look, the government is socialist in China, but then, of course, you have capitalistic businesses where the businesses are managed on sound financial principles, of course, with heavy government investment. You have the US President Donald Trump imposing upwards of 200% on Chinese made products. But then, of course, you have China turning that around and it had export in its export market. Basically, China had a trade surplus of $1.2 trillion. So you can imagine how basically China is such has grown by double digits year on year, basically by leveraging on capitalism. So, of course, these reforms were enacted by none other than Deng Xiaoping. Of course, whereas Mao Zedong is characterized as the father of modern China, but of course, then you have Deng Xiaoping being characterized as the mother of father of economic prosperity. So that's it from the Citizen Tanzania. That is new social protection policy brings Tanzania's informal sector workers into national safety net. So then I will move over to another headline in Africa, and that is Tanzania's medical tourism agenda gets major boost with KCMC's STEAM surgery. So this is about medical hospitals. We don't have many hospitals. We don't invest enough on healthcare. So basically, medical tourism, it is Africans that go outside for treatment. Think of a country such as India. A lot of Africans go to India when they get debilitating medical conditions such as cancer or maybe kidney transfer. Of course, they would have loved to go to the West, maybe to America, such as the Mayo Clinic or the Massachusetts General Hospital, but then they go to India is affordable. It has almost the same standard of medical practitioners as the United States, but just at a tenth of the cost. So you can imagine a lot of uh, a lot of these a lot of African patients go to India. So why not develop the hospitals right here in Africa? If our leaders don't want to be treated in our hospitals, then why are they managing our hospitals in the first place? That's what we must ask. If our leaders are not being treated in our hospitals, then why are they in the first place managing our hospitals? That is something that we really need to think about, and I would hope that we basically get to the root of the matter and are have hospitals that can treat all and sundry. Making a healthcare free and affordable should be a goal for all African governments. Then I will move over to another headline. Another headline exposed how governors, senators, and Holy Alliance is looting funds. That is how governors, senators, and Holy Alliance is leading to looted funds. So basically, the entrenched corruption in Kenya's decentralized units. So basically when Kenya instituted governance reforms so that power could be devolved. So Kenya has two layers of government: the national government and the county government. So when these county governments came into being, it was thought they were going to bring about self-determination, about semi-autonomous units, but then that does not happen. What happens it is that these governments are basically it is that these governments are basically and corruption is entrenched in this government. So basically, you have that unholy alliance of governors and senators leading to the looting of funds. I think every governor in Kenya is a billionaire, and just prior to being elected, they were paupers just prior to being elected. But then when they are elected, they become billionaires overnight. So this looting of funds, when shall it stop? This looting of funds of African wealth. When shall it stop? So that's it from the Daily Nation Kenya. Then still another headline from Daily Nation Kenya: how we turned our D's in KCSE exams into success. That is how we turned our D's in KCSE exams into success. So that's about failing in high school. KCSE is the exit high school exam in Kenya. So basically, if you fail in high school, does that mean that then that is the end of you, that you will not get success? That's far from it. I just think that if you fail your exam, and then there are other ways you could start low. You could start with a certificate course, then go to a diploma course, and finally a degree course, and even go for masters and PhD. But then, of course, that is the pathway you could take. And I think we need to treat all people that if you fail in exam, that is not the end of life. That basically you can do well. I think in major countries, they have a way of transitioning from the lowest levels of education to the highest levels. Look at Japan. If you fail your exams, you go to 2 year college. If you fail absolutely, you go to a 2 year college. If you fail moderately, if you perform moderately, you go to a college of technology. And then if you pass well, you go to elite universities such as University of Tokyo. And I think what happens then, you could transition from a certificate from craft colleges to College of Technology to university. I think from College of Technology, you go into third year in the university. So you can imagine that failing in exams is not the end of life. That is just what we need to think about it. And I think then again, our education systems is about rote learning, about exam taking. So those who pass exams are the ones who can memorize things faster, and that just shows you that basically in Kenya, in Africa, the system is dropped. So that's it from the Daily Nation Kenya. Then I will move over to another headline, the standard headline: While William Ruto splashes millions, Kenyans stare at death. While William Ruto, the president of Kenya, splashes millions, Kenyans stare at death. So this is about the drought situation in Kenya and the Horn of Africa in the northern region. So William Ruto is availing millions to young people so that they can start businesses. But a lot of people think that this is merely a campaign promise. So basically, you have Kenyan, you have President Ruto basically splashing millions, but then of course you have that is you have to wonder why not treat the drought in the first place. And I think these perennial droughts, why can we not plan well so that we know at such and such a time there will be lack of rain, and so we prepare for it. I think you have two extremes. On the one hand, you have drought, which brings about famine, and on the other hand, you have flooding, which brings a drowning, again another loss of life. So that means that basically this is not to be entertained. There needs to be a planning. Why not have the Kenyan scholar Bitangen demo says water can be harnessed so that we can have that water during flooding, during heavy rains, stored in tanks, so that then that water is available to be used during times of drought. But that requires a prior planning, and that is why there is drought, lack of planning. Again, I would say we don't have efficient person governors that utilize resources optimally so that their people can prosper. Another top headline, I will move over still to the Standard newspaper Kenya, how ODM, that is the opposition party, can boost its value ahead of coalition talks with the ruling party UDA. So this is about opposition and coalition politics in Africa. So do coalitions really work in this part of the world? I just think they don't work because the difference between the ruling party and the opposition party is not in ideology, is not in ideas. It is in the tribe and region they draw support from. So basically, you have this coalition talks. The opposition party ODM has entered into a coalition with the ruling party UDA, and it has four mini cabinet ministers. So that means then it the so-called broad-based government. So basically, the Secretary General of the opposition party, Edwin Sifuna, was kicked out because of saying they must fill a presidential candidate. But it is not just a uniquely African problem. Even in other African countries, in other countries around the world, coalition governments are very slippery. Look at South Africa, the ANC, the oldest liberation party in Africa, founded in 1912. It did not it got only 40% of the vote and had to go into a coalition with the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, that is the DA. So basically, you have a coalition, and I think a coalition always makes the opposition weaker because when do you stand by your principles, support the sitting government, but then criticize it when it goes wrong. So you basically are between a rock and a hard place between supporting the government of the day, whilst also making sure that your agenda is enacted. And so a lot of people lose track along the way, and it is not a uniquely Kenyan problem. I think it occurred during, and I think even for the UK, you had the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats go into coalition with the Conservative Party in 2010 during David Cameron and I think Nick Clegg, but then it weakened Nick Clegg so much that he had to get out of politics, where he was made the deputy prime minister. So that's it from the Standard Media Kenya. Then another top headline from the Standard Another top headline from the Standard: Israel envoys bid to make Kenya a startup nation. That is, Israeli envoys bid to make Kenya a startup nation. So, what do we have to do in order to make startups thrive in Africa? So, basically, Kenya wants to position itself as the Silicon Savannah, where it is the Silicon Valley of Africa. So, there's a lot of startup activity in Kenya, but then there is not much venture capitalism. I think out of the $625 billion that was advanced to startups in 2021, only 1% went to African startups. So you can imagine that basically there's too much money chasing founders in There's too much money chasing founders in a country such as the United States, but in Africa it's the opposite. You have to be of Stanford or Harvard pedigree in order to get funding for your startup. Just imagine. So if you are a run of the mill out of the window, jumping through the window, then basically you don't get you don't get funding, and that is just we need a venture capital fund. The business model of venture capital firms is that the business model of venture capital firms is that you have them having you have them the business model of venture capital firms is that you have them basically you have them fund many small startups fund many startups hundreds of them even at cheap rates at small amounts, and then of course a few of them will become blockbusters. Of course, majority will fail, but a few of them will become blockbusters. So that's how you get to fund them, and that's something that I think a lot of. So, what does it take to make Africa a startup capital of the world? Number one, have a affinity for talent. We need to have lots and lots of talent. Basically, we need to churn out great talent from our universities. So they should be industry universities. Think of Stanford, gave us Google, gave us Yahoo, gave us Sun Microsystems. Think of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. MIT gave us, according to a report by the Kaufman Foundation, a non-profit that supports entrepreneurship, the wealth of startups of MIT alumni, founded or co-founded by MIT alumni, is $2 trillion. So that will make it the 11th largest economy if it were a separate country. So we need industrial universities in Africa so that then we can have this talent. Basically, we need industrial universities in Africa so that this talent can be of major benefit to our people. So that's it from Standard Media Kenya. Then I will move over to another headline: the new vision Uganda, General Muhoozi and the political economy of African sovereignty. So basically, this is about Africa sovereignty. So are our military independent? So that means that General Muhoozi blamed the United States for the escape of Bobby Wine. That's what General Muhoozi did. He blamed the United States for the escape of Bobby Wine. Of course, Bobby Wine came in second at 24% of the vote in the Ugandan elections, and so they wanted to take him in so that President Museveni could have a free reign on leadership. So basically, he blamed the United States. And look at Nigeria. The United States airstrikes against Boko Haram terrorist group. So how can we be having foreign military interference in Africa? That's something that I think we really need to think through. Then another headline in Africa: my country, Somaliland, recognized our first embassy will be in the Jewish state, whose aspiration and history we share. So Somaliland. So Somaliland is a breakaway region from Somalia, and so of course it has a fairly functional economy, has a fairly a stable government, but its passport is not recognized internationally. So Israel became the first country to recognize Somaliland, and of course, Mogadishu, that is Somalia Federal State, has always said Somaliland is part of its territory. So, of course, this country will not be recognized internationally, and I think you have then a lot of the people can't travel abroad. So basically, its passport is not recognized internationally, but it has a fairly stable economy, and they do have universities. They do have a system of economy And I just think maybe it's time for that Somalia reunited with Somaliland. And I think the fall of Siad Barre in 1991 meant that a civil war ensued, and up to now, Somalia has never known any peace. So that's the headline from the Iran online. My country, Somaliland, recognized our first embassy will be in the Jewish state. So that's still from the Iran online, that is Somalia. Political allied settlement over the election could legitimize Somalia's fragile state. So that's about Somalia. And I think a lot of libertarians really believe that we should have made Somalia into a functioning state. A lot of libertarians believe that Somalia really collapsed as governments don't work. And I think in Somalia, it has the lowest data cost in Africa and the seventh lowest data cost in the world, all because 11 telecom companies compete for 11 telecom companies compete and offer value for money for a subscriber. So you can imagine, and I think that should be something that we really need to think through of how we can make Somaliland be that, how we can make maybe Somalia to be more stable so that then there is peace in the Horn of Africa. And then another top headline from the Addis Standard, Ethiopia inches ever close to war. That's another top headline from the Addis Standard, Ethiopia inches ever close to war. That is according to the economy. So of course you have the Tigray region, and of course, that means that that country is unstable. And of course, Abiy Ahmed, the prime minister, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 because of the peace process between Eritrea and Ethiopia, where they were literally at war because they never signed any peace deal. And so, of course, Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki and Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed have reached a truce. Does Ethiopia is Ethiopia inching ever close to war? And maybe that's something that will make the Horn of Africa region to be largely destabilized. Then another top headline from Africa, from at this standard, Horn of Africa is arena becoming arena for Gulf rivalry as Ethiopia drawn into power struggle. So the Gulf countries are literally battling between themselves on what Gulf countries are battling within themselves on what can make on who has who has the influence in the Horn of Africa region. So basically, the Horn of Africa, you have in Sudan, the UAE is accused of supplying weapons to the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces (RSF) that is battling the government of the day in Sudan. So you have the UAE accused of supplying weapons to Sudan. You have in the Gulf countries such as Turkey, Gulf countries are battling for supremacy in the Horn of Africa. Then another top headline, still from La Nation Djibouti. From La Nation Djibouti, India on track to become the world's third largest economy. That is, India on track to become the world's third largest economy. That's according to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So, of course, India is following China, and maybe the question to ask: India and China were at the same level of development in the 1980s. So why did China pace ahead and literally become is on the cusp of becoming the world's largest economy? And I think maybe around 2027 or 2028, China will be the world's largest economy. Of course, that will be detrimental to the United States. So China practiced communism, which meant a centralized system and faster decision making, whilst India practiced whereas India practiced a democracy, a wobbling democracy. That means which comes with a lot of bureaucracy and of course a lot of bureaucracy, and so that meant that there was corruption, there was a slow decision making, and so that's why India wobbled as China paced ahead and is on the cusp of becoming the world's largest economy. Think about America. They say America is wobbling because it is led by lawyers, while China is thriving because it is led by engineers. So that's it from the land nation Djibouti. Then another top headline from La Nation Djibouti, higher education training to become independent. So this is about what sort of higher education do we need in Africa? What sort of higher education do we need? Basically, we need an African education system that trains for the skill as well as trains for the mind. So people go to university to get the requisite skills. So basically, our universities became teaching entities. No research is taking place in our universities. In the 1990s, the World Bank advised African countries that they should divest from higher education and invest on basic education. So a lot of our universities are really just teaching entities. They are not top of the range industrial universities that can make Africa that can bring about African Renaissance. So African Renaissance has to start with having universities that will become top of the range, having universities that will truly mean that we having universities that will truly mean that we are at the top of the table. And I think we need industrial universities. And then the other issue is about the arts. What is the future of the arts? As many people think an arts degree will not lead to a job after a graduation. What is the prospect of an arts graduate? The Ugandan president Yoweri Museveni said that studying the arts was useless. And then you have the Kenyan President William Ruto saying, of what use while studying Vasco da Gama, about Vasco da Gama, of what use while studying about Vasco da Gama be of help? So basically, I just think that what we need right now is to have a system that have a liberal arts system, maybe train for the skill as well as train for the mind, so that maybe you have a degree in mechanical engineering and a diploma and a certificate in history, or maybe a degree in history and a certificate in mechanical engineering, so that then you are able, you have at least a degree that will put food on the table, but then your mind is enriched, and so that you become a better citizen. Literally, many education systems in Africa ensure that we have great experts but terrible citizens. That is why Africa is bleeding. We have education system that create great experts able to solve the toughest quantum physics equations and the toughest rocket science equations. But then, of course, able to analyze the latest Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Chinua Achebe literature. But then, of course, we have the same education system. We have the same education system that does not train citizens to be responsible citizens. Then I will move over to another headline. A presidency seeks 38% budget increase. That is Radio Tamazut, South Sudan. That is the presidency seeks 38% budget increase. So why are we spending all resources on the presidency? This is a living large by the presidency. Why are we spending so large on the presidency? Think of Thomas Sankara. He was able to travel in a motorcade of just 3 or 4 vehicles, and sometimes used a bicycle. And of course, for that, he was assassinated by his friend and compatriot Blaise Compaoré at the behest of France. So basically, why are we making having such large budgets for the presidency. The truth is that in Africa, we have rulers. We don't have efficient patient governors that utilize resources optimally so that the people can prosper. We don't have that. We have rulers who are attracted by the trappings of power, and that just needs to change if we are to develop. Then another top headline: Kenya-led mediation from Radio Tamazight, South Sudan. Kenya-led mediation explains delay in Tumaini peace talks. So that's the civil war in South Sudan. The president Salva Kiir and the Israel opposition leader Riek Machar are not seeing eye to eye. So how then can we have reforms if these people are not seeing eye to eye? South Sudan is Africa's newest republic. South Sudan is Africa's newest republic. So it became independent. South Sudan became independent. South Sudan became independent, I think, in 2011. So basically, that means then that needs to change. That needs to change if we are to make South Sudan truly stable and prosperous. So that's it from Radio Tamazu. Kenya-led mediation explains delay into many peace talks, and then still another top headline from Sudan Tribune. Another top headline from Sudan Tribune: a Sudanese group suspends participation in French-led peace process. That is, a Sudanese group suspends participation in French-led peace process. That is a Sudanese group. This is from the Sudan Tribune. Said a Sudanese group suspends participation in French-led peace process. So why are we depending on outsiders to keep peace in Africa? That is what we must be asking ourselves. Why are we depending on outsiders to bring about peace in Africa? That needs to change. We need to be using the resources in Africa for the growth and benefit of our people. That is not happening, and I think African solutions to African problems. That's what uh, uh, the likes of Thabo Mbeki advocate for. That is African solutions to African problems. Then another top headline from the Guardian Nigeria: CBN's regulation and Nigeria's leadership vision in fintech reality. So if you want to get startup funding, then you either are in fintech or entertainment. That is the way to get startup funding in either fintech or entertainment. The other sectors don't draw as much over funding. So basically, Nigeria is a leading tech hub, but how does it become a global center where you have a lot of these innovations taking place? And I think Nigeria was notorious for internet scams, and that is why the Central Bank of Nigeria had that is why the Central Bank of Nigeria came down hard. I think they came down hard even on fintech. But you have a Nigerian fintech company such as Flutterwave, which is a unicorn. A unicorn basically is a $1 billion startup. So basically, that's CBN's regulation and Nigeria's leadership vision in fintech reality. So that's it from the Guardian Nigeria. Then another top headline. Uh, that is still the same headline in CBN's regulation and Nigeria's leadership vision in fintech reality. Then another top headline: Nigeria spent 3.53 trillion naira importing raw materials locally available. So why can't we use that which is in Africa? We don't value add. We basically think the Made in Africa brand is inferior, and I think that causes a lot. Think of Nigeria. It exports crude oil, then imports refined petroleum at exorbitant prices. And I think it is only recently that Dangote built the Dangote refinery plant, I think at about $20 billion, that now you have a lot of, and now you have a lot of Nigerians now get cheaper oil courtesy of Aliko Dangote. So basically, he built $20 billion Dangote refinery. So you can imagine how very much uh, Nigeria was losing a lot of money in exporting raw crude oil and importing refined petroleum products. So we must be able to use our resources here at home. We must convert cocoa to chocolate, convert cotton to designer clothes, convert gold and diamond to jewelry, convert uranium to nuclear power, convert titanium to aeroplane parts, convert copper to electronics, convert coltan to mobile phone and computers. That is the way that we will be able to make sure that we have an Africa that is truly able to add value to its minerals. So that's it from the Guardian in Nigeria. Then, of course, I will move over to another headline. Punch Nigeria. From Punch Nigeria, US deploys 200 troops to Nigeria. US deploys 200 troops to Nigeria. So this is another top headline, and I think what we need to do is to be able to focus on our own security. Of course, US President Donald Trump says that Nigeria has Christians are being persecuted in Nigeria. That is why he sent those 200 troops to train Nigerian soldiers. But when do we ever have to take care of our security? Isn't that self-governance that we need? Why should we be depending on America for security? That's what we must be asking ourselves. Why should we be depending on Nigeria for security? That is something that we really need to think about. I think it must be shown that this is what we must be able to do. We must be able to provide for our own security. That is the way that then we will be able to. That is the way that we can. Or that's the way that we can ensure we are self-governance. Otherwise, these other countries will just make Africa their playground. And then another headline. Uh, Home Punch Nigeria, Dangote cuts fuel price, explores new Burundi investments. That is, Dangote cuts fuel price, explores new Burundi investment. So that's about the Dangote refinery. That's an African success story. And of course, Aliko Dangote now wealth has multiplied. Maybe his worth about now around $30 billion. He is the richest black man in the world, and maybe he should teach us a lesson or two about entrepreneurship. So basically, that's a story of triumph, a story of entrepreneurship. And I think the entrepreneurs are the ones who will lead Africa out of the wilderness. I think our politicians, change will not come from our politicians, as many would think. Change will not come from our politicians. Change will come from our entrepreneurs. I think our entrepreneurs are the unsung heroes. The fact that Africa has so many problems the fact that Africa has so many problems means that then we entrepreneurs will have a field day in Africa, and that's why we need outside countries are seeing the opportunities in Africa. But why aren't Africans seeing opportunities in their own backyard? Why aren't Africans seeing opportunities in their own backyard? So that's something that we must really think through. Then another top headline as if my ancestors were speaking to me from the ocean in Senegal. African Americans are on a pilgrimage. So, of course, the Gory Island. Gory Island was the last point of departure for captured African slaves. That is, Gory Island was the last point of departure for captured African slaves. So, basically, Gory Island, Goree Island basically was the last point. So African Americans, we must bridge the divide between African Americans and Africans. Of course, they say Africans, maybe African Americans are resentful because Africans sold them to slavery. But of course, that is not what to be. That was pure capitalism at play. And I think African kings have apologized for that selling of their kids and kin abroad. You heard the singer Kanye West say that slavery was a choice, and of course, for that, he earned an invite to the White House. So, of course, as if my ancestors were speaking from me in the ocean. So, you had Ghana. Ghana had the year of return in 2019, in which it encouraged African Americans to come home and see Africa for themselves. Of course, I think African American is a paradox because an African American is an African without memory because his history begins when the slave ships arrived in America and so is confined to the 600 years of black subjugation and not to the thousands of millennia of a triumph of black civilization. So that's it from Le Monde, Senegal, and then I will move over to another headline the the word box, the election, and the population. So, do elections really serve us? Maybe that's what we need to ask. Do elections really serve us? Do elections really serve us? I don't think elections are serving us. That's why there is still a lot of military coups in Africa. Look at the heroism of Ibrahim Traore. Look at the heroism of Ibrahim Traore. Ibrahim Traore Ibram Traore basically uh, uh, has a digital card because people believe that these governments are not working. And so when they see the reincarnate of Thomas Sankara, Ibrahim Traore, being able to initiate all these development projects, they clap their hands because he is really trying his best. Look at the projects of Ibrahim Traore. There is a social housing, there's new roads, there's national airline, there's national airport, there is a container depot off the coast of Ghana and an inland depot on the border with Niger, Chad, and Mali. There is a post bank, there's a university polytechnic, there is tomato processing plant, gold processing plant, and a cotton processing mill. So all these projects are being enacted by the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, and I think he deserves to be the president of Africa. At least that is what I think. And then still another headline. So, do elections, can democracy deliver the results we need? Can it deliver prosperity to Africans? Look at China. It has no democracy, but it is growing by leaps and bounds. Of course, the Communist Party is made up of 90 million members. So basically, they make the decisions on how China is run. So you can see that benevolent dictatorship maybe is what Africans need. That is what led to the emergence of the Asian tiger, South Korea. Malaysia, Singapore. Think of the story of Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew, who made his country come from third world to first world in a record 25 years. So you can imagine that Ibrahim Traore is then able to bring about benevolent dictatorship in Botswana, in Burkina Faso and Africa as a whole. So that's it from Le Monde, Senegal. Then I'll move over to another headline, free quality Sierra Leone Telegraph, free quality education in Sierra Leone, promise progress and the hard truths we must face. So this is about free education. And I think we need a free education. What do we pay taxes for? These taxes must not be for people to just go and enjoy themselves for politicians to loot these taxes. Our politicians are looting these taxes, and that's why there's such a cry that Africa is not developing because our politicians are using the taxes to enrich themselves. And this is why I say when you account for corruption outflows from Africa, then Africa is a net donor to the world. It is not a net recipient in aid. That is why then I will hope that that is why I will hope that our taxes are used efficiently. And I think if our taxes are used efficiently, then there will be no need to avoid taxes. But if you see your taxes are not leading to better roads, to drugs in hospital, doctors in hospital, to teachers in classrooms, to infrastructure projects, to jobs after graduation. If your taxes are not being used in that way, then I think the system has failed. So that's it from the Sierra Leone Telegraph. That's it from the Sierra Leone Telegraph. Then I will move over to another headline. M23 rebels welcome SANDF departure from MONUSCO. So this is Mail and Guardian South Africa. Of course, South African soldiers have departed from Eastern DR Congo. Of course, the conflict there in DR Congo is fueled by conflict. It is about mineral resources in Eastern DR Congo. Of course, DR Congo has accused Rwanda and Uganda of abetting the instability in Eastern DRC. Of course, Eastern DRC has the important minerals of coltan that is used in the making of semiconductors for mobile phones and computers, and of course for AI, it will be instrumental. And you have the president of DR Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, going to the US, flying to the US in order to meet the US President Donald Trump. But of course, Trump is a businessman, so he wants those mineral resources to go to America. So basically, the president of Zambia, Hakainde Hichilema, says mineral resources must not be a source of conflict, but should be about bring about economic stability. Look at Africa, look at mineral resources and the way they have fuel wars. Look at Eastern DR Congo, look at northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado region in northern Mozambique, look at all these countries, Cabinda, breakaway region of Angola, look at all these countries where mineral resources are fueling conflict, and I think that just needs to stop. We need to view mineral resources as benefiting the people of Africa. We have the engineers, we have the money. The African Development Bank must be about facilitating African countries to be able to undertake this mineral to undertake these projects. That is how Africa is going to prosper. And I think if Africa prospers in that way, then we will have prosperity. But for now, this is not happening because it is the foreign countries that are benefiting from our mineral resources. So that's it from Mail and Guardian. South Africa about M23 rebels welcoming the departure of South African troops from that region. Then, still another Helen Mail and Guardian, South Africa, ANC wants Swane mayoralty even without outright win in 2026. So that's about outright win. So basically, what I'm asking is the ANC doomed because its support is waning? You had the firebrand leader, Julius Malema, leave the ANC, so that is something the African Liberation Parties have they lost out. I think the only two liberation parties that are still in power in Africa is the CCM in Tanzania, Chama cha Mapinduzi, that is Party for Revolution, and I think the ANC. But the ANC won only 40% of the vote in the 2024 election. It got only 40% of the vote and had to go into a coalition with the opposition DA. So basically, DA I think manages Cape Town province. So basically, that shows you that Africa still has a long way to go. And that shows you that Africa ANC has a long way to go in order to recapture some people. Some old South Africans look back to the nostalgic times when of apartheid, when there was water in the taps, when their schools were inferior, but they were running. But now they are looking at self-governance, and you heard South African former president, second last apartheid president P.W. Botha saying South Africa was built by white people, was built by the white mind for the white people. And so that's quite a kind of a segregation that led to apartheid because it was believed Africans were inferior, maybe supported by the Bible, maybe the children of Ham are the descendants of Africans, so are the ancestors of Africans. So basically, we need the NC to work so that it can show that Africans, given a chance at self rule, can indeed that is, Africans given a chance at self-rule can indeed lift themselves by their own bootstraps. Then another top headline from the Namibian government's bloated wage bill spent on unproductive workers. So this is about the Western government. Basically, there is a lot of waste in our government. So why so much waste? I believe there is enough money to make Africa prosperous, but that money is wasted by our government. So how do we make our governments lean and efficient? Think about it. If you are a private sector player, you are given money if you are given money and then at the end of the project you executed the project and then of course at a fraction of the budget and of course you will be congratulated, you will be praised by your supervisors, many even on a promotion. But then in government circles, if you are given money for you are allocated money, then you do your job well and then at the end you have money left over. In fact, they will ask you, why didn't you spend this money? So you can't see the difference between how government works and how the private sector works. But I think the true liberation of Africa will come from the private sector. That will be the true liberation of Africa. It will come from the private sector. I don't think it will come from the government. So our entrepreneurs, Aliko Dangote, Tony Lumelo, Dr. James Wangi, Stroy Masiwa, they must step up to the plate and ensure that the opportunities in Africa are working. That is how to be able to develop Africa and make sure that we are indeed a continent that is on the rise. So the Silicon Savannah, the African lion, will roar when the entrepreneurs realize that they can indeed lead to development of their own country. So we need capital to flow to business ideas in Africa, and that is how Africa will be able to that is how Africa will be able to grow by leaps and bounds. So that's it from the Namibia. That is governments bloated wage bill spent on unproductive workers. Then we'll move over to another headline. Another headline. This is from Lusaka Times. From Lusaka Times, that is mining should not be a source of conflict, but a source of prosperity. That's according to the Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema. That is, mining should not be a source of conflict, but should be a source of prosperity by our governments. That is how I think then African. That is how I think Africa can change, and that is how I think we should be doing more so that then we can have an Africa that works. And I think mineral resources, that's value add. We cannot just be exporting our mineral resources without adding value so that they create the jobs. For instance, cotton that is exported from Uganda to Italy creates 13 times more jobs in Italy than it does in Uganda. So that's something that I think we must really think through mineral resources and not benefiting our people. So that's it from the daily, and that's it from the Lusaka Times in Zambia. Then we'll move over to the second last headline for the day. That is inclusive growth. That is from the Daily News. Botswana inclusive growth centered to addressing social challenges. That is inclusive growth centered to addressing social challenges. So this is about Duma Boko saying that maybe there needs to be prosperity. I think what worries more is not even inequalities between countries, it is inequalities within countries. And I think that is something that we must be able to think through. I think in countries such as South Africa, it is explainable that the inequality is between is racially delineated, so that you have whites being prosperous and blacks being bottom of the mill. But then, of course, in other countries, for instance, explains the inequalities in Nigeria, what explains the inequalities in Nigeria, where you have in 2018, Nigeria surpassed India as the country with the most absolute poor people in the world at 118 at 85 million. But in the same year, 2018, Nigeria was the fastest growing market for private jets. So, what explains that inequality? Basically, you have celebrity CEOs, celebrity pastors, you have billionaires, you have politicians using basically using flying around Nigeria because of the pothole roads. But then, of course, in the same year, Nigeria was surpassed India as the country with the most absolute poor people. So that's it. Then the final headline for the day. Investor, and that is from the Herald Zimbabwe. Investor interest in mining increases. US $400 million projects approved. So basically, that is it shows you we are exporting raw materials. For how long will I repeat? Let's convert gold and diamond to jewelry. Let's convert cocoa to chocolate. Let's convert coffee to coffee drinking chains. Let's convert copper to electronics. Let's convert coltan to mobile phones and computers. Let's convert copper titanium to aeroplane parts. Let's convert wood to paper. That's the only way we can add value so that then the wealth gets to remain right in Africa. Otherwise, we are exporting this wealth, and there is no denying that we will be the poorer for it. So that's it for now. Bye for now. Till the next time. Bye for now.